September 26, 1986. Jalalabad, Eastern Afghanistan. CIA operative Michael Vickers watched through binoculars as the mujahideen fighter hoisted the olive green tube onto his shoulder. The man had trained for exactly 47 minutes on the FIM-92 Stinger missile system. Not nearly enough time by U.S. Army standards, but all they could risk in Taliban-controlled territory. 3 Soviet Mi-24 Hind helicopter gunships approached in formation, their distinctive double-bubble cockpits glinting in the afternoon sun. These flying tanks had terrorized Afghan villages for 6 years, their 12.7-meter machine guns and rocket pods turning mud brick homes into graves. The Stinger's IF, identify friend or foe, system chirped. Target acquired. The fighter squeezed the trigger, a brief hiss. Then the missile leapt from the tube trailing white smoke, its infrared seeker locked onto the lead helicopter's engine exhaust. The Soviet crew never saw it coming. One moment the Hind was banking toward the village. The next, a brilliant flash engulfed its tail section. The helicopter spun violently, rotors screaming before slamming into a rocky hillside. The explosion echoed across the valley. The mujahideen erupted in celebration, firing AK-47s into the air. Vickers felt exhilaration and something darker. He'd just handed the most sophisticated portable air defense system in the world to fighters who, 5 years earlier, most Americans couldn't have found on a map. The weapon would help drive the Soviets from Afghanistan. It would also become the most regretted arms transfer in American history, its serial numbers appearing in conflicts from Chechnya to Iraq for the next 4 decades. But on that September afternoon in 1986, watching Soviet air superiority evaporate in smoke and fire, none of that seemed to matter. The decision to arm Afghan resistance fighters didn't begin with Stingers. It began with wounded American pride and a desire for Cold War revenge. When Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan on December 24, 1979, President Jimmy Carter's National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, saw an opportunity wrapped in a tragedy. "We now have the opportunity of giving to the USSR its Vietnam War," he wrote in a memo to Carter on December 26th, barely 48 hours after Soviet paratroopers seized Kabul's airport. The CIA's initial assessment was cautiously optimistic. Agency analysts believed the mujahideen, literally those who struggle, could bleed Soviet forces through guerrilla warfare, making Afghanistan costly enough to strain Moscow's already fragile economy. The Soviets will discover that it's one thing to invade Afghanistan, CIA Director Stansfield Turner told President Carter, and quite another to govern it. The Afghans have been fighting foreigners for 2,000 years. Operation Cyclone, as the covert aid program became known, started modestly. In 1980, the CIA funneled $30 million to the mujahideen through Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, primarily providing Second World War-era Lee Enfield rifles and ammunition. The aid doubled to $60 million in 1981 under President Reagan, who saw Afghanistan as a chance to implement what would become known as the Reagan Doctrine, actively rolling back Soviet influence rather than merely containing it. Reagan's rhetoric was characteristically bold. The freedom fighters of Afghanistan are defending principles of independence and freedom that form the basis of global security and stability, he declared in 1985. But his CIA director, William Casey, thought even bigger. Casey envisioned not just bleeding the Soviets, but defeating them outright, turning Afghanistan into Moscow's graveyard. "I want to see those godless communists driven out of Afghanistan," Casey told colleagues at Langley. "Whatever it takes." Soviet planners initially shared Washington's confidence, though from the opposite perspective. The Politburo believed they could stabilize Afghanistan within months using the same overwhelming force that had crushed the Hungarian uprising in 1956 and the Prague Spring in 1968. Afghanistan is not Czechoslovakia, KGB chairman Yuri Andropov warned, but he was overruled. Soviet Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov predicted, "This will be over by spring. The Afghan army will be reorganized and competent. Soviet forces can return home by summer 1980. By late 1983, neither side's optimism had proven justified. The Soviets controlled the cities, but not the countryside. Their 100,000-man force killed thousands of mujahideen, but tens of thousands more kept fighting. And Soviet casualties mounted, officially 1,500 dead by 1984, though Western intelligence estimated the real number at twice that. The war had become exactly what Brzezinski predicted, a quagmire that drained Soviet resources and international legitimacy. But it hadn't become a defeat. Not yet. The early 1980s saw Operation Cyclone transform from a modest guerrilla support program into the largest covert operation in CIA history. By 1984, annual funding reached $250 million, matched dollar for dollar by Saudi Arabia, in a secret arrangement brokered by Prince Turki al-Faisal and CIA Director Casey. The money flowed through a deliberately convoluted pipeline. CIA funds to Pakistan's ISI, which purchased weapons from Egypt, China, and other suppliers, then distributed them to 7 main mujahideen groups based in Peshawar, Pakistan. The arsenal evolved rapidly. British-made blowpipe anti-aircraft missiles arrived in 1984, though they proved almost useless. Too complex for fighters with minimal training and too slow to catch Soviet jets. Swiss Oerlikon 20mm anti-aircraft cannons provided better results, but required trucks to transport, making them vulnerable to Soviet airstrikes. Chinese Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades and Egyptian copies of Soviet AK-47s flooded the mountain passes. By 1985, the mujahideen were firing 60,000 rounds per day, more ammunition than the entire U.S. Army had consumed in some months during Vietnam. But Soviet air power remained dominant. Mi-24. Heinz operated with near impunity, turning valleys into kill zones. Their tactics were ruthless and effective. High-altitude bombing followed by low-level strafing runs that obliterated villages suspected of harboring mujahideen. Soviet Su-25 Frogfoot ground attack jets dropped napalm and cluster bombs. High-flying Tu-16 bombers carpet-bombed from altitudes the mujahideen couldn't reach. Without effective anti-aircraft weapons, the mujahideen controlled nothing Soviet helicopters could overfly. "We owned the day in the valleys," one Soviet helicopter pilot, Alexander Rutskoy, later recalled. "The Duki," the Russian slang for bandits, could shoot at us with machine guns, but they rarely hit anything. We came in low and fast, and they died. Michael Vickers, the young CIA officer who would become Operation Cyclone's principal strategist, arrived in Pakistan in 1983 and immediately recognized the problem. A former Green Beret and CIA paramilitary specialist, Vickers had studied unconventional warfare at Johns Hopkins University, where his master's thesis examined how guerrilla movements could defeat conventional armies. Afghanistan, he concluded, required a systems approach, the right combination of weapons, training, and tactics, tailored to the specific Soviet vulnerabilities. "The Soviets have adapted to our weapon supplies," Vickers wrote in a classified assessment to Casey in early 1985. "They fly higher, use flares against heat seekers, and concentrate forces to overwhelm mujahideen positions. We need to escalate, or we'll watch this insurgency slowly die." His recommendation was radical. Provide the mujahideen with America's most advanced man-portable air defense system, the FEM-92 Stinger. The debate that followed would consume Washington for 18 months. The State Department argued that Stingers represented an unacceptable escalation, likely to provoke Soviet retaliation and potentially nuclear confrontation. "We're talking about giving terrorists access to technology that could shoot down civilian airliners," one State Department memo warned. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger worried about security. Once these weapons leave our control, we have no way to get them back. They'll be on the black market within months. Even within the CIA, doubts festered. Some analysts feared the weapons would be captured and reverse-engineered by Soviet intelligence. Others worried about blowback, a CIA term for unintended consequences of covert operations. "We're arming Islamic fundamentalists who hate the Soviets today," one CIA analyst wrote in a dissenting memo, "but may hate us tomorrow. What happens when this war ends?" But Casey steamrolled the opposition. He found an ally in Under-Secretary of State Michael Armacost, who argued that defeating the Soviets justified the risks. Most importantly, Casey had President Reagan's ear. Reagan had met with mujahideen leaders in the Oval Office and called them freedom fighters. When Casey presented the Stinger proposal in early 1986, Reagan barely hesitated. "Do it," he ordered. The approval came with conditions. The CIA would maintain strict accountability. Every missile would be serialized and tracked. Mujahideen would be trained by CIA and British SAS instructors, not merely given weapons and wished luck. And the Stingers would be distributed only to the most reliable commanders, not the radical Islamists like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, whom even Pakistani intelligence considered dangerous fanatics. In practice, these conditions proved impossible to enforce. The first Stinger missiles arrived in Afghanistan in September 1986. Delivered to a carefully selected mujahideen unit commanded by Abdul Haq, a moderate resistance leader with strong ties to CIA handlers. The weapons came with a 3-man British SAS training team that had exactly 1 week to create competent operators. The Stinger's elegance lay in its simplicity. Unlike the complex blowpipe, the Stinger was fire and forget. Aim at the aircraft, wait for the IFF to lock on, indicated by an audible tone change, squeeze the trigger, and let the infrared seeker do the rest. It was beautiful, one CIA officer later told journalist Steve Call. A farmer who'd never seen electricity could learn to use it in an hour, and it almost never missed. The missile's technical specifications were extraordinary for 1986. The Stinger weighed just 35 pounds fully loaded, with a maximum range of 26,000 feet and a speed of Mach 2.2, faster than any Soviet helicopter and most jets flying low-altitude missions. Its seeker could discriminate between aircraft and decoys. Its warhead was designed to detonate inside the target rather than merely proximate to it. And its solid fuel motor left almost no smoke trail, making the launch point difficult to locate. That first kill on September 26th was followed by 2 more the same day. 3 Soviet helicopters downed in a single afternoon. Within a week, mujahideen units across eastern Afghanistan were reporting Stinger kills. By October, Soviet helicopter losses had tripled. By November, Soviet pilots were refusing to fly low-altitude missions, fundamentally altering the war's tactical landscape. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Rutskoy, the same pilot who had earlier boasted about dominating the valleys, barely survived a Stinger attack on October 14th. "I was on approach to Jalalabad when the alarm screamed," he recalled in his memoir. "I dumped flares and pulled up hard. The G-forces nearly made me black out. The missile missed by meters. My weapons officer was screaming prayers. We landed with hydraulic fluid pouring from the fuselage. After that day, I never flew below 5,000 meters." The psychological impact matched the tactical. Soviet helicopter crews, previously the war's hunters, became the hunted. Flight surgeons reported epidemic levels of stress disorders. Some pilots developed physical symptoms, tremors, night sweats, panic attacks, that grounded them. "The Americans have given them a miracle weapon," one Soviet Air Force report admitted. "Our helicopters are coffins. Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, moved frantically to acquire stingers for analysis. They offered mujahideen commanders $100,000 per missile, an enormous sum in a country where the average fighter earned $200 per month. Some missiles were indeed sold, but not enough to matter. Soviet engineers who examined captured stingers found technology a generation ahead of their own systems. "We have nothing comparable," one GRU technical assessment concluded. Attempts to develop countermeasures face fundamental technological gaps. The Soviet military adapted with characteristic ruthlessness. High-altitude bombing increased dramatically. Tu-16 and Tu-22 bombers carpet-bombed from 20,000 feet, beyond Stinger range, turning entire villages into moonscapes. Soviet ground forces implemented new tactics. Smaller, faster-moving units supported by artillery rather than helicopters. Attack helicopters fitted with crude infrared jammers and began dropping flares continuously during missions. Though these countermeasures had limited effectiveness against the Stinger's sophisticated seeker. But the damage was done. Soviet air mobility, the foundation of their Afghanistan strategy, had been neutered. Troops that previously could be reinforced or extracted by helicopter now required ground convoys vulnerable to ambush. Casualties rose. Morale plummeted. "We stopped winning," one Soviet officer told the BBC years later. "From 1986 onward, we were just trying not to lose." Between September 1986 and February 1989, when the last Soviet forces withdrew, Stinger missiles destroyed approximately 270 Soviet aircraft, helicopters, jets, and even a few transport planes. The CIA eventually delivered 2,300 Stingers to Afghanistan, though the exact number remained classified. Each kill cost the Soviets between $5 million and $50 million, depending on the aircraft type, not counting trained crew. More importantly, each kill forced tactical changes that slowly strangled Soviet operational effectiveness. The Stinger didn't win the war, Michael Vickers later reflected, but it made the war unwinnable for the Soviets. Once they lost air superiority, they lost the initiative. Once they lost the initiative, they lost the will to continue. On February 15, 1989, General Boris Gromov walked across the Friendship Bridge spanning the Amu Darya River from Afghanistan into Uzbekistan, the last Soviet soldier to leave. Soviet television cameras captured the moment. Gromov paused mid-span, looked back at Afghanistan, then continued north. The war had killed approximately 15,000 Soviet soldiers and wounded 50,000 more. It had cost an estimated $45 billion and contributed significantly to the Soviet Union's economic collapse. It had exposed the Red Army's vulnerability and shattered the myth of Soviet military invincibility. In Washington, the mood was triumphant. "We've avenged Vietnam," one CIA officer told the Washington Post. "The Soviets limped out of Afghanistan the same way we limped out of Saigon." President George H.W. Bush, who had taken office just weeks earlier, praised the mujahideen as heroes and promised continued American support for Afghanistan's reconstruction. But the celebrations masked an emerging disaster. The mujahideen hadn't defeated the Soviets to establish democracy. They'd defeated them to establish Islamic rule, and the weapons America had provided didn't disappear with Soviet withdrawal. They proliferated. The CIA's elaborate tracking system for Stingers collapsed almost immediately. Of the 2,300 missiles delivered, the agency could account for approximately 600 used against Soviet aircraft. That left 1,700 Stingers unaccounted for, each one a heat-seeking weapon capable of downing a civilian airliner. Some were captured by rival mujahideen factions and sold to Iran, which paid $100,000 per missile. Others appeared in Pakistan's black market, where arms dealers offered them to anyone with cash. Intelligence reports tracked stingers to terrorist groups, narco-traffickers, and regional governments hostile to American interests. "We knew this would happen," one CIA officer admitted in a 1993 classified debrief later leaked to journalist George Kreil. "Casey ordered us to track the missiles, but ISI distributed them to commanders we never met. Once they reached Afghanistan, we had zero control. Zero." The agency launched buyback programs offering $150,000 per returned Stinger, but recovered only 300 missiles over a decade. The weapons were simply too valuable and too dispersed. Worse, many fighters who'd learned to use Stingers turned those skills toward new conflicts. In Chechnya, Stinger-trained mujahideen helped rebels shoot down Russian helicopters in the 1990s. In Bosnia, Stingers appeared in Muslim forces' arsenals. In Iraq after 2003, U.S. military intelligence documented at least 6 incidents of Stingers or Stinger components in insurgent caches. The most terrifying scenario: terrorists using Stingers to shoot down civilian airliners, came horrifyingly close to reality multiple times. In 1994, Algerian terrorists attempted to use a Stinger against a French airliner at Orly Airport, but were arrested before they could fire. In 2002, Al-Qaeda operatives launched 2 SA-7 missiles, Soviet equivalents to Stingers, at an Israeli passenger jet taking off from Mombasa, Kenya. Both missed, but the attack demonstrated terrorist capability and intent. In 2003, British intelligence thwarted a plot to use Stingers against American commercial aircraft at Heathrow. Every time there's a credible threat involving manpads, man-portable air defense systems, the question is always the same, a former FAA security official said in 2008. Is it one of ours? Is it a Stinger we gave to Afghanistan? The Stinger's legacy extended beyond missing weapons. The men who fired them and the ideology that motivated them became America's next enemy. Among the foreign fighters who flocked to Afghanistan in the 1980s, drawn by CIA-funded recruitment and Saudi money, was a wealthy Saudi named Osama bin Laden. He didn't personally fire Stingers, but he built the financial and logistical networks that moved weapons and fighters across the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. He met the most radical commanders. He absorbed the lesson that disciplined Islamic fighters using advanced Western weapons could defeat a superpower. "We found out that the Soviet Union was already tottering," bin Laden would later tell an interviewer. "When we saw this, we started training the best soldiers on the Stinger rockets. The battles that lasted until the Soviets withdrew, those were the real schools." The CIA had worried about arming Islamic fundamentalists, but convinced itself that pragmatic moderates like Abdul Haq and Ahmed Shah Massoud would prevail once the Soviets left. Instead, in the most radical factions, those willing to fight other Afghans, not just foreigners, seized power. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's Hezb-e-Islami received the most CIA weapons through ISI despite his extremism because Pakistani intelligence favored him. When civil war erupted in 1992, after the Soviet-backed government collapsed, Hekmatyar's forces used CIA-supplied weapons to bombard Kabul, killing 50,000 civilians. The Taliban emerged from this chaos in 1994, promising order through strict Islamic law. Many Taliban commanders had fought the Soviets with American weapons. When they seized Kabul in 1996, they inherited warehouses full of CIA-supplied arms, including Stingers. They also sheltered Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda organization, which began planning attacks on American targets. The blowback from Afghanistan, CIA analyst Milt Bearden later acknowledged, was worse than any of us imagined. We trained people to fight a superpower, gave them sophisticated weapons, and then walked away. We created the infrastructure that became Al-Qaeda. We empowered the Taliban. We didn't cause Islamic extremism, but we absolutely gave it oxygen and weapons. On September 11, 2001, The logic of 1980s covert operations came full circle. The attacks that killed 3,000 Americans were planned by an organization whose leader had been part of the CIA's anti-Soviet coalition. They were organized from Afghanistan, where American weapons still littered the landscape. The subsequent U.S. invasion found stingers in Taliban and al-Qaeda caches, American missiles pointed at American helicopters. 4 decades after the first stinger killed a Soviet helicopter, U.S. forces finally withdrew from Afghanistan in August 2021, ending America's longest war. The Taliban returned to power, and among the equipment they captured from fleeing Afghan government forces were weapons whose lineage traced directly to Operation Cyclone, including night vision goggles, communication systems, and in some cases, ammunition, whose calibers matched those the CIA had flooded into Afghanistan in the 1980s. The Stinger program's immediate success is undeniable. It helped drive the Soviets from Afghanistan, contributed to the Soviet Union's collapse, and demonstrated that American technology could enable proxy forces to defeat a superpower. Michael Vickers, who oversaw the program, became a Pentagon legend. His strategy of asymmetric warfare through technology advantage influenced U.S. military doctrine for decades. But the long-term costs dwarfed the short-term gains. The missing 2,400 Stingers created permanent security threats that cost billions to mitigate. Airport security measures, military aircraft countermeasures, intelligence operations to track the weapons. The jihadi networks built to fight the Soviets metastasized into terrorist organizations that killed Americans for 30 years. The Afghan Civil War, fueled by CIA weapons, created the failed state that became al-Qaeda's sanctuary. And the 20-year U.S. war in Afghanistan, which killed 2,400 American troops and cost $2 trillion, was in many ways a consequence of decisions made in 1986. We won the Cold War, former CIA Director Robert Gates reflected in his memoir. But we're still fighting the wars that came after. Every Middle Eastern terrorist with a shoulder-fired missile, every failed state used by extremists, every jihadi who learned to fight from us, they're all ghosts of Afghanistan. We armed them, trained them, and inspired them. Then we were surprised when they turned on us. The Stinger's technical brilliance couldn't compensate for strategic myopia. The CIA focused on defeating the Soviets without considering what would fill the vacuum. They empowered the most militant factions because those factions fought hardest, ignoring warnings that militants don't disarm when the war ends. They prioritized winning a Cold War battle while losing sight of the broader geopolitical chessboard. The parallels to current U.S. foreign policy are unavoidable. When the Biden administration left $7 billion in military equipment to the Afghan government in 2021, equipment that fell to the Taliban, echoes of the Stinger program's unintended consequences reverberated. When the United States arms Syrian rebels or Ukrainian forces, the ghost of Operation Cyclone haunts policy debates. The fundamental question remains unanswered. How do you wage proxy wars without creating tomorrow's enemies? We treated Afghanistan like a Cold War chessboard, Milt Bearden said in a 2011 interview, where the only thing that mattered was beating the other superpower. We forgot that Afghanistan was a country full of people who'd keep fighting after we and the Soviets went home. We gave them the tools to fight forever, and they did. On September 26, 1986, Michael Vickers watched a Stinger missile destroy a Soviet helicopter and felt the thrill of victory. He couldn't know that 40 years later, American pilots would still be watching the skies for those same missiles. He couldn't know that the freedom fighters Reagan praised would become the Taliban that harbored al-Qaeda. He couldn't know that the most successful covert operation in CIA history would also become its most regretted. But perhaps he should have. The lesson was there in CIA's own institutional memory, written in Vietnam's aftermath. Arms don't disappear when wars end. They proliferate, migrate, and eventually point back at their suppliers. The Stinger missiles that helped win the Cold War are still out there, somewhere in hands we can't control, waiting to become headlines. They're a permanent reminder that tactical success and strategic wisdom are not the same thing, and that in proxy wars, victory has a way of becoming defeat when you're not looking.